From the darkest reaches of space to the deepest corners of your mind. Welcome to From the Void.
There are some places that refuse to let go of their past. Fox Hollow Farm, an unassuming estate in the Indiana countryside, holds a dark and terrifying history. It was once the home of Herb Baumeister, a man suspected of luring men to his property, never to be seen again. Authorities believe he was responsible for the deaths of at least a dozen victims, their remains scattered in the woods behind his house. But decades later, chilling new evidence is coming to light, and the truth may be even more horrifying than we ever imagined. A brand new docuseries, The Fox Hollow Murders: Playground of a Serial Killer, now streaming on Hulu, takes a fresh look at this infamous case, uncovering new details, new theories, and even new potential victims. Today, I'm joined by the series director, Alex Jablonski, to discover what went into making this groundbreaking documentary, the shocking revelations he uncovered, and what it was like stepping into a crime scene that still seems to whisper its secrets. This is From the Void, and you're about to step into the darkness. All right, welcome to the podcast, Alex. Thank you so much for spending some time this afternoon with me on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So tell the audience a little bit about your background and kind of the work that you do.
Yeah, I'm a documentary filmmaker, make TV series and feature-length documentaries, done commercials as well, but not necessarily a true crime person, but always a focus on documentary and trying to bring a kind of cinematic feel into nonfiction.
Yeah, absolutely. I just caught this new documentary series on the Fox Hollow Farm's murders, and this is a very complex and sort of unique, we were talking before we started, a very unique kind of true crime story. What first attracted you to the story? You just said that, you don't typically dive into true crime. So what about this particular story kind of made you think, hey, I'd like to make a documentary series about this?
So I was approached when folks already had a little bit of a framework for the series. And the series is called The Fox Hollow Murders. It's on Hulu. And what it is about is that there was a serial killer in the mid-90s named Herb Baumeister who preyed upon gay men in Indianapolis. Eventually, they found the remains, just the bones, the skeletal remains of a number of people, still determining how many people exactly. But it amounted to 10,000 bones and bone fragments on his property in suburban Indianapolis, in an area called Hamilton County. And so the reason that this story came to the surface recently is that a new coroner by the name of Jeff Jellison became the coroner of Hamilton County and decided, oh my God, I can't believe that we haven't actually found who these young men were, who these remains were. So he wanted to go back and do DNA testing on these remains to find out who they belonged to. So that was the present tense piece of the story. And I think what interested me is that, most true crime is about an adjudicated case, a case that went to trial, that had some resolution. And the majority of it is in the past tense. It kind of walks you through a timeline of this happened, then this happened, and there are twists and turns, but you ultimately know where it's going. But that's not really the type of filmmaking I'm interested in. I really like present tense stories. So my previous series prior to this one was called Navajo Police Class 57. It's on HBO. And that is a story that unfolds in front of you of a class of recruits going through the Navajo Police Training Academy. And so what interested me about this story, this is a long way to get to answer your question, but what interested me about this story is that it took place in the present, that there was an aspect where you were going to be able to see things about this case unfolding in front of you. And so I was really interested in that. Were we going to see the coroner identify new victims? Were we going to see him find new bones? Were we going to see new breaks in the case? And inevitably, all of those things began to happen.
Yeah, it's a really sort of unique situation. One comparison I've heard is, to Herb Baumeister, it is some of the prior serial killers that we know from like the 70s and 80s who also preyed on gay victims. So there is definitely, you kind of shed a light on some of the prejudice that took place in the original investigation, but there's so much more to it. There's so many more layers to it. And so one of the things you mentioned were the bones. So kind of for people who aren't as familiar, kind of describe the property that we're talking about, because obviously it takes place in Indianapolis, Indiana. and he's pulling victims from sort of the metropolitan area, but he's taking them back to this kind of unique home and property that's kind of very unique to this case, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's called Fox Hollow Farm, but the term farm, it is not a working farm. I think that's a marketing, ploy, if anything, because really what this is like this palatial estate. So it's 18 acres and it has forced paddocks on it and a barn, but it's not a farm in the sense of growing crops or anything like that. So it's 18 acres, heavily wooded. And in the mid-90s, when these crimes were taking place, it was even more kind of remote than it is now. I think suburban sprawl has encroached on it. But it was very isolated. And it's this large, I think, 10-bedroom, 2-door mansion that is probably, I would say, 6,000 square feet. And it has these woods that come right up to the back of the property. And that was where he would dispose of the victims, in these woods behind his house.
Yeah, one of the other interesting aspects of this case is that this home also has this indoor pool. And one of the things that was sort of unique to Herb Baumeister is he seemed to have this fascination with mannequins. And he had these mannequins like all over the property. And also, his money came from, and you could talk a little bit about this, he owned a business. He was a business owner and he had mannequins just everywhere in that space too. And so some of the people you spoke with in the documentary series talk about like this sort of weird fascination with mannequins.
Yeah, I mean, he ran what were called Save-A-Lots, which were essentially thrift stores, like a Goodwill, but a for-profit thrift store. And so he would have kind of mannequins that he would buy from distressed, clothing stores that were going out of business. He would buy their mannequins and then he would use them at his thrift stores, but then he would position them in his little playroom and his bar area downstairs and in the pool area downstairs as well. And he had this indoor pool. For the longest time, the belief was that the indoor pool was a bit of like a lure to bring men back to the house. Like, hey, do you want to come back to my place? I've got an indoor pool. We can go swimming, that type of thing. And the understanding of the case is that most of the criminal activity took place in the pool area or the adjoining bar area.
Yeah, and so like a lot of serial killers, he has sort of his public life and then he has his private life. And Herb was a married man with kids. And so how did he get away with, as you research this case, how did he manage to keep those two lives very separate?
So I think that, what we discovered, and I think the police found this as well, is that he had this separate lake house that was, I think, about 2 hours away, maybe 2.5 hours away at Lake Wawasee. And my understanding is that this was a family lake house, something like his parents had owned. And so he would send his wife and their kids off to the lake house for a week in the summer or for a weekend. And it was during that time that he would go to the gay bars, find his victims, bring them back to Fox Hollow, kill them, and dispose of the body. All in the span of time while his family was out at the lake house. There's this bifurcated life, this kind of two separate lives is a question mark. I mean, I think in the house, the downstairs, when you're in the actual property, the downstairs is the pool area, it's the bar, there's a bathroom, and you can shut the door to the pool area and not even know it's there. It feels like it's totally separate. So there's literally like a sense of two separate lives. At the same time, and I think a lot of viewers had this question as well, there is some question as to what his wife can do. How much could she not have known? I think that one thing that's interesting to me is that the way that Herb selected his spouse is not all that dissimilar from the way he selected his victims. So he would select his victims knowing that they didn't have very strong family ties. Maybe they were estranged. Oftentimes they were poor. They were hustlers. They were looking for money. Julie Baumeister didn't have very strong family ties. She was not super close with her parents, and she did not come from a lot of money. And so in many ways, Herb was her lifeline. And so he could isolate her. And she wasn't having big family parties where people are going, Herb is acting strange, or like, God, the house smells weird, or any of the other things that, you would hope that your extended family would say. And so I think in some ways he selected his spouse to be someone who was almost like conducive to these activities, which I think he knew he was going to be doing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because that certainly is one that pops up, not just in his case, but a lot of cases of serial killers who are married, like the Green River Killer and BTK. It's like, how did their families not know? Because obviously this is a time-consuming activity where he's not only engaging with these individuals and murdering them, but he also has to dispose of the body and presumably clean up afterwards in such a way that no one would know, no one would be the wiser.
Well, I'll tell you this. So it's not in the series, but we had someone reach out to us who'd been friends with one of Herb's children. And, the story goes that, and the evidence is there, that at a certain point, Herb began burning these bodies. So he was burning these bodies in essentially like a pyre out in the woods. And that's why we have so many small bone fragments, because when bones burn, they shatter and break into really small pieces. And this woman who at the time had been, I think 13 or 14 year high and had gone over to the Baumeister property, she said that to this day, she cannot forget the smell. And if you think about it, burning corpses are going to have a very kind of unique odor. And maybe at that time, that's what she was smelling. But this also gets to how much did the family know? How much did the family not know if there was this kind of odor of death and burned flesh in the house?
Yeah, absolutely. Have you ever felt like something isn't quite right in your home? Footsteps when no one's there? Cold spots? Whispers in the dark? We've launched FTV Paranormal Investigations, and we want to hear from you. Whether it's your house, a historic building, or a property that you own, if you think something unexplained is going on, we'll come investigate. Just head to our website, www.fromthevoidpod.com, and click on the FTV Paranormal Investigations tab. Fill out the contact form with all the details, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. And here's the best part. If we catch anything compelling, your case could end up featured on an upcoming episode of From the Void. So if you think you're not alone, maybe you're right. Now, back to the show. So talk about a little bit about how ultimately, because there's a unique character that adds a very unique twist to this entire story. And ultimately, that's the character in this story that eventually leads to Herb's, discovery, so to speak. He's never quite arrested, but, we can get to that part. But talk about that unique character who initially kind of paints themselves as this person who, was a would-be victim and managed to escape. And as far as we know, probably the only one. So talk about...
and they're going to be spoilers. So if you're listening to this podcast, pause it, go watch the series, come back, and then you can resume. And trust me, it'll be a richer conversation if you hadn't watched this. So who you're speaking about is Mark Goodyear. And I think it's really important that folks understand that this series, at a certain point, almost on a minute-by-minute basis, is breaking new ground on a serial killer case that's 30 years old. So up until this series, the conventional wisdom and the public's understanding of the Baumeister case was this, that Baumeister was killing these men. He was meeting them at a series of gay bars in a small area in downtown Indianapolis. He was bringing them back by himself to his property. He was then strangling them and leaving their bodies in the woods. In August of 1994, a guy comes forward to Mary Wilson, a detective with the Indianapolis Police Department's Missing Persons Division, and says, I went home with a guy and he attacked me, and I think he's the one who's been kidnapping or abducting these gay men and causing them to go disappear. And this guy's name, the survivor's name, was Mark Goodyear. And he said that the person he'd gone home with had said that his name was Brian, which was an alias that supposedly Herb would use. And so Mary Wilson, the detective, gets very interested in this. She says, great, take me out to the house. They make multiple trips out there, at least 3 times. He says, gosh, I just can't find it. She says, okay, well, if you learn of anything else, let me know. So that's August of 1994. Not until, I believe it's July of 1995 or August of 1995. So a full year later, this same person, Mark Goodyear, says, I've got his license plate number. I've got Herb Baumeister's Brian's license plate number. Gives it to Mary Wilson. Mary Wilson runs the plates and comes up with Herb Baumeister in Hamilton County. That discovery of his plates eventually leads to getting onto the property where they, but not for another 6 months, where they find human remains. That is the conventional story. Mark Goodyear is a hero. He is the one who brought the police to Herb Baumeister, and that is ultimately what led to Baumeister killing himself and the discovery of all these remains. In our series, there are 2 things that happen. One is that we interview Goodyear. The other is that we go back into the police files that hadn't seen the light of day in 30 years. What happens in your understanding of this case, because of what we discovered, is that you realize that Mark Goodyear did not just spend one night. It was not a one-night stand with Herb Baumeister. He says, actually, I lied to the police. I had a 2-year-long relationship, which he hesitates to define as romantic, but certainly sounds romantic. Was it financial? We don't know. But he said, I had a 2-year-long relationship with Baumeister. This is while the murders were happening, and some of Goodyear's friends were the ones who were murdered. And then at the same time, in the police file, so if you just had that, you go, maybe this guy's a fabulist. Maybe he's making this stuff up. Maybe there's, he wants the attention or the proximity to a serial killer, and he gets off on that kind of fame or notoriety. You could totally say that. Except when you dig into the police files, you have Baumeister's business attorney calling the police and saying, Herb had called me and he said he was very worried about this person named Mark Goodyear. He spelled his name. He said that he left a note for his wife about Mark Goodyear. He said he left a note at the store about Mark Goodyear. You have a witness who says, I saw a murder take place at Fox Hollow and Mark Goodyear was there and Herb Baumeister shot the guy while Mark Goodyear held his hands. And then you have the interview that I did with Goodyear himself, where he seems to kind of skirt right up to the edge of admitting at least being present for the murders, and then will veer the conversation in a different way. He confirms that he had a relationship with Baumeister. He even says that he stalked Baumeister. And so all of a sudden, our understanding of this case, the collective understanding of the past 30 years goes out the window. And now we have to look at it in a totally different way, because one of the other really interesting things is everything that we know about the case, the manner of death, how these victims were lured to Fox Hollow, it all came from Mark Goodyear. And so the question becomes, well, what was he not saying, or what was he saying to lead the police off of the scent if he himself was involved?
Yeah, he is quite an interesting character, and you do such a great job of sort of showing that he is one who clearly likes to sort of put on a performance and is very, sort of theatrical type character. And I think the other thing you do a great job of in the documentary series is you don't quite know from one moment to the next if what he's saying is true or if he's, as you said, sort of embellishing on things that were true. And so you're kind of left wondering, like, who is this guy, and what involvement did he have at this point? Like, why did the police not look further?
So there's two theories on why the police didn't look further. And just to get back to the way you were kind of setting up this question, my hope for the series was that people were going to have the exact reaction that they're having, which is, I don't know what is going on here. Like, because I think that it would have been totally inauthentic for me to say, and this is what we know, blah, 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 and like wrap it all up in a bow and give you a conclusion. Instead, I wanted the audience to kind of have the experience I had of, oh my God, it's like everything starts shifting underneath your feet. Your understanding is changing moment by moment. You're getting this piece of information. And so all of a sudden what Goodyear's saying seems real. Then you're getting this piece of information and, well, I don't know if I should believe that or not. And then what ends up happening is that more and more of what Goodyear's saying is actually being corroborated by very hard evidence from either journalists or police reports. So, I think that the question as to why the police did not pursue this case, there's two theories. The first is that these men were young gay men. Some of them were sex workers, and they just were not that interested in solving it because of a kind of systemic homophobia. This was also at the time of AIDS, where you had, the Reagan administration kind of blaming gay men for the AIDS crisis and not willing to fund AIDS research, leading to the deaths of gay men, the unnecessary deaths of gay men. And so there was almost this kind of like societal sense of like, oh, these people don't matter as much as, say, a, single white female. And so the cops, once Baumeister killed himself, they said, hey, look, like, we're not going to trial with this. Why would we need to work this case? Our suspect is dead. Forget about it. That's one theory. But what the thing about that is, what I still, to this day, cannot understand is that you have someone who calls the police and says, I saw a murder, and this person was present, because he mentions people other than Mark Goodyear. He says, this person was present, this other person was present, this other person was present. And they didn't bring any of those folks in for questioning. Steve Ainsworth, who's this cold case detective who's in our series, one of the things he said to me is he said, look, crazy people, you can think this Leroy Bragg was crazy. Maybe you want to dismiss him as like, oh, he was high or whatever. People who are high, people who are crazy, people who are a little weird see crimes all the time. And it doesn't make what they say any less valid. And so to him, he was like, they should have at least went and talked to these other folks that he named, because he named, I think, 3 individuals who the cops were aware of, and they never brought those guys into question. So one theory is there was systemic homophobia. They didn't care and they just let it go and they thought they would move on to other things. The issues with that theory are that Hamilton County only had about 2 or 3 homicides per year. So it's not as though there was this like massive caseload and it's Baltimore or LA where it's like, oh my God, the cops are so overworked. They've got to move on to the next one. And there's another victim who needs justice, etc. It was like, I don't know what it was they were moving on to, So then you get to the darker, more conspiratorial theory, which is that were there forces at work that incentivized the police to not look into this case, to not look deeper into it. And I think that's a question.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there is some, you bring forth the question. Herb Baumeister, for those who, you Google him and you see a picture of the guy, he's not a big guy. And he somehow managed to get countless bodies. We still don't know how many out into the woods, which is if you see the map of the property, is a bit of a distance from the house. And so there's a lot of question as to whether or not he would have physically been able to carry these out single-handedly without help. And so that sort of then continues to point another finger towards Mark Goodyear as perhaps being an accomplice.
Yeah, I think the question of how did he dispose of these bodies by himself has always been a huge question. Because, we know from the dates of disappearances and when Julie was coming back from the lake house, Julie Baumeister, Herb's wife, that he would have like maybe 24 to 48 hours to kill this person and dispose of their body. And so one of the working theories was that he, strangled these guys in the pool. And the reason, just we're going to get into some real murder 101, but the reason the thinking was he strangled them in the pool is that if you are a smaller guy, he was like 180 pounds, he wasn't that big, and you're strangling someone, they're naturally going to fight back. If they're in the pool, what they're pushing off of, they're just kicking against water, and it's actually easier to overpower them. But then you have where the bodies were discovered, which was like 600, 750 feet at times in the woods. So how did he get them from the pool area into the woods? And the woods, having walked the woods, at that time, there were no paths cut into the woods. It was very thick. There were down trees. There were, weeds and vines all over it. If you were to drag them, it would have been a very brutal task. A wheelbarrow wouldn't get through there. If you're putting them on your shoulder, that's also going to be very tough. And, from talking to detectives who've moved dead bodies, they say it's really difficult. How would he have been able to do that so quickly with such a high volume where he's killing sometimes 2 people in the span of 2 weeks? So that was one question. And then the other theory was maybe he put a gun on these guys and he tied them up and then he walked them back there and he shot them. But then you also get this question of so someone's going to both hold a gun and tie someone up at the same time like that, or he drugged them and tied them up and then marched them out there. But it seems very difficult for one person to do. And none of the remains showed evidence of gunshot wounds. So that also, just in terms of the evidentiary piece, we don't have any evidence that anyone died of a gunshot wound. At the same time, the skulls are missing. Again, there's so many questions to this case. But yeah, it seems, having walked those woods, having been out there, it strikes me as nearly impossible to do the work that he did and to commit the crimes that he did all by himself.
That was part 1 of my conversation with Alex Jablonski, director of the chilling new docuseries, The Fox Hollow Murders, Playground of a Serial Killer, available to stream right now on Hulu. But we've only just begun to scratch the surface of the secrets that surround Herb Baumeister and the dark legacy he left behind. Part 2 of our interview drops next week, where we'll dig even deeper into the investigation and what Alex uncovered while filming this unnerving story. If you're enjoying these journeys into the unexplained, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to From the Void on your favorite podcast platform. And share this episode with someone who loves a good mystery. Because the more we talk about the darkness, the more light we bring to it. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and keep looking into the void.